Following a 911 call by Lizette Hogland Hall, the police arrived at her house in Anchorage, Alaska to find a woman, Elizabeth Omotara Santos, wearing just a robe, unable to stand, mumbling through slurred speech, and in general incoherent. Her robe was covered in blood. However, she was handcuffed and placed in the back of an ambulance to wait for 37 minutes before the vehicle left for the hospital. Later, she was to be declared dead, and more than 2 years after her tragic passing, many details around the case remain blurred and inconsistent. What really happened to Elizabeth the morning of August 8, 2020? How did the investigation go? Why have the local news outlets all but refused to cover the case? In August of 2020, Elizabeth had just broken up with her longtime boyfriend of 10 years, reportedly after undergoing a traumatic experience. She was a Florida native, but had been residing in Wasilla, Alaska, a relatively small town of 9,000 people that is part of the Anchorage metropolitan area, about a 45-minute drive from Anchorage. Trying to clear her head and to be far away from her boyfriend, Elizabeth decided to go to Anchorage to visit her friend Lizette Hogland Hall, planning to stay with her for a few days. Contemporary accounts from several friends that were either interviewed by the police or by subsequent investigators hired by Elizabeth's family, and in some cases directly by Elizabeth's family, have mentioned that she seemed to be doing okay, all things considered. It appeared that despite being devastated by the breakup, she was working on healing and trying to move on, and seemed to be in good spirits while staying with Lizette. However, something would change on the early morning of August 8th. According to most accounts, including the original story told by Lizette, she was involved in a fight with Elizabeth around 6 a.m. on the morning of August 8th. Lizette admits that Elizabeth had beat her in the fight, though she claimed no major injuries. She said the fight had broken out in the garage of her home and that she ended up on the floor. Lizette initially said that after the fight, she went upstairs to hide with her adult son, Desmond, in the bathroom. Next, she decided to call 911, since Elizabeth, according to her, was still being erratic and violent and banging on the walls. The supposed loud bangs caused by Elizabeth, however, can't be heard on the 911 call. Lizette's account of everything that happened from the moment she lost the fight to the moment where Elizabeth was taken in the ambulance would vary wildly in several different interrogations, as well as in subsequent interviews. The APD patrol officers arrived about 6:15. They claimed Elizabeth's state seemed to suggest that she had consumed something. Although Lizette would later claim that she gave Elizabeth only some Benadryl pills, a toxicology report obtained by Elizabeth's family suggests she had traces of midazolam in her body at the time of death. This drug is used to treat seizures as well as for patients entering an ICU and has the effect of reducing consciousness in a patient, causing drowsiness, and helping reduce anxiety. It is a strong drug, and according to her family, Elizabeth had no history of using that drug or of seizures. Although there was some initial speculation, especially given the state in which the police found her, that Elizabeth had consumed some other drugs, the toxicology report, along with several declarations from close friends who denied she ever consumed drugs, helped dispel that theory. Apart from Elizabeth's incoherent state, the officers later said they thought the wounds weren't that serious, even though documentations from later sources said the robe was drenched in blood. To this day, the police continue to claim that the robe was drenched in sweat, not blood, despite the medical reports stating the amount of blood she lost, and the fact that Lizette admitted that the police saw her wipe Elizabeth's blood from the floor while they were there. Lizette would later claim that she did it as an instinct, trying to clean her home's floor. It doesn't seem likely that with the amount of blood she lost, along with the fact that enough of it wound up on the floor for Lizette to instinctively try to wipe it up, the police failed to realize Elizabeth at least had a significant injury. At 6:42, near a half an hour after the police arrived, Elizabeth was handcuffed. 4 minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and she was taken, still handcuffed, to the ambulance. However, the ambulance wouldn't leave for another half an hour. It was only after Elizabeth went into cardiac arrest because of her grave injuries at 7:20 that finally the ambulance started to move. It left Lizette's residence at 7:23. Lizette and Desmond were left alone at her house, as the police officers also left. Elizabeth's iPhone was somehow left with Lizette, who was able to unlock it. At 7:36 a.m., the ambulance made it to the hospital and Elizabeth was rushed to emergency surgery. The doctors said they were perplexed with the amount of blood she had lost. The hospital called APD at 7:50, explaining that Elizabeth had multiple stab wounds on her legs and abdomen and that she was in critical condition. At 7:56, almost 40 minutes after leaving the crime scene unattended, the officer went back to Lizette's house and took mother and son into custody. Although it was claimed they were handcuffed, footage from the care shows at least Desmond wasn't. APD has claimed that no body cam footage from the incident exists. During the time when Lizette and Desmond were alone at the crime scene, Lizette made several phone calls from Elizabeth's iPhone, the last one to Elizabeth's sister, Nikki. "Your sister Elizabeth owes me money. She has some holes in her." Cops burst into the house while the phone call was still ongoing. Through that phone call is how Elizabeth's family found out about the situation. Lizette and Desmond were transported in separate cars and interrogated separately. Lizette's account of what happened started to diverge slowly but surely to what she initially claimed and would later change even more, leading to many inconsistencies. For example, she would first claim she didn't know where Elizabeth was when the police arrived, while also saying she was sure she was upstairs. She would also say that Elizabeth spent the whole time banging on the bathroom door, but later said she didn't know where she was at all during the time they were locked. Lizette also said when they locked themselves in the bathroom, Elizabeth had no injuries, claiming then that all the injuries were self-inflicted. Lizette describes in detail the knives that she says Elizabeth used for stabbing herself, while also claiming initially she didn't see any blood or the moments of the stabbing. Desmond's interrogation, however, was wildly different. Instead of going into a detailed explanation of what happened, he asked for an attorney. He didn't make an official statement to the police about what happened. After learning of Elizabeth's passing while she was being interviewed, Lizette's account of what happened would yet again change. Although she said at one point that she never saw blood and didn't know that Elizabeth was hurt until after the 911 call, after learning of Elizabeth's death, she claimed that she saw blood while they were hiding in the bathroom and that she called 911 right after she saw the blood. Lizette's story would change a lot, often contradicting itself and other available evidence, seriously calling into question the veracity of her story. On a later date, she would even start to claim that she actually had witnessed how Elizabeth slit her own throat and stabbed herself repeatedly. Elizabeth died that morning. In the afternoon, both Lizette and Desmond were freed, despite Lizette's felony history of violent assaults. Elizabeth's death has never been officially ruled as suicide, despite it appearing that the APD is taking Lizette's testimony at face value. Her friends and co-workers, interviewed by the family and private investigators, have repeatedly said that Elizabeth didn't seem like she was on the brink of self-harm. A close friend of hers said Elizabeth called her the day before her death to plan a girls' trip, and that she was doing well after the breakup. That same friend said Elizabeth mentioned that she felt safe because her ex didn't know where she was. The friend says Elizabeth was really scared of her ex. Lizette has claimed that Elizabeth was acting erratic and violent on the days prior to her death. According to all the friends and co-workers interviewed, Lizette's description of Elizabeth's behavior sounds really out of character. All of them describe her as nonviolent and not a drug user, and several had normal interactions on the days leading up to her death. The night previous to her death, Elizabeth was apparently having insomnia, staying up late, but apart from that, most of her activities seemed pretty normal for most of the night. Her phone activity shows she was listening to music and speaking with her friends. In the early morning, however, the pattern changed. Elizabeth called her ex several times and begged him to answer the phone at 3 a.m. He didn't pick up. Some neighbors have claimed that an unknown blue truck and unfamiliar man had been to Lizette's house that week. However, there has been no connection made between that man and the crime, and no connection established to Elizabeth's ex, apart from the claim by a friend that Elizabeth was scared of him. After her death, Elizabeth's ex started saying that she had once handled a knife in an altercation with him. This is unconfirmed, and her ex's sister says that his memory can't be trusted because of several medical conditions. Apart the calls to her ex, Elizabeth made several other calls to friends that went unanswered, including to a friend who woke up to find 9 missed calls. On a later date, Desmond would respond to inquiries from a private investigator about the case. Desmond said Elizabeth cut herself and that it didn't seem too bad, but he also said he didn't know where and how deep the cuts were, and that he didn't witness when Elizabeth grabbed the knife or when the cuts happened. He also said that he didn't see the altercation between his mother and Elizabeth, and that he didn't see any physical marks of the altercation on her mother or signs of struggle in the house. Although a lot of DNA evidence was picked up from the scene, including the apparent murder weapons, the knives which were completely devoid of any blood from the moment the police arrived, APD has refused to analyze it. Fingerprints, for example, appear to have been taken of at least one of the knives that are claimed to have been used by Elizabeth to cut herself, but there have been no tests to establish that connection. Elizabeth's family says there is a lot of forensic evidence that hasn't been processed, which would help find out the truth about what happened. Apart from the refusal to process forensic data, the case has also been buried in the news. There is a lone report from a single local newspaper talking about the case. When the family reached out to the reporter who initially wrote the piece about Elizabeth's case for them to update the initial piece with more recent findings, they never got the answer. The reporter later left the newspaper without updating the article. Several other reporters have either been approached by the family or approached by the family themselves, but always when the time for a publication nears, nothing is printed. The family suggests the APD might be suppressing any news about Elizabeth because of what they claim was a gross mishandling of the investigation and evidence by members of the police force. To this day, it is not clear what really happened during Lizette's and Elizabeth's altercation and how Elizabeth's ultimately mortal wounds occurred. What is clear is that there are severe inconsistencies in Lizette's numerous declarations, as well as mysterious circumstances surrounding the procedure followed by the police and later the ambulance during the initial hours of the case. Also, the continued refusal to process forensic evidence and the apparent active effort to suppress any news about the case show that the case warrants a second look that might at least help Elizabeth's family find some solace, and maybe even a semblance of justice for her tragic death. The main problem appears to be that the ones that need a long, hard look are the ones accustomed to doing the looking.